walk us through that. But let me tell you a little bit about Rick. We know Rick's a fighter pilot in his past, and that's kind of a cool sort of Top Gun thing that I like about Rick. And you can judge his personality by that. He also flew for many years for American. He's retired from American Airlines. Rick also, in his spare time, as he calls himself an independent historian, but he got a PhD in the history of ideas, and that's a unique PhD. It's where concepts meet culture and the ways they influence. Tonight, Chris, are you good with your setup?
Very good to go.
Very impressive. So we're going to play a quick video, and then Rick will take the stage.
Okay.
Take it away.
Well, this is from the series that we're doing at our church, but tonight I'm repurposing it because it's very relevant to what we're doing here with looking at morality and what the implications are for sourcing morality. Where did morality come from? You know, we all have a sense of things that are right and wrong. Why? And we're going to ask that question tonight from several different aspects. But was it from a moral source? Was it for survival of the fittest? Was it biological? How did it get here that we have this sense of right and wrong? And so I appreciate the chance to be with you guys. And Robert, thanks for the invitation. It's been fun to be here before, and I'm looking forward to a night of some thought-provoking ideas, I hope. I do want to let you know that I am totally unqualified to be here. I am not a moralist. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. So you have no reason to listen to me. But I did some research. And one thing that a graduate degree does teach you to do is do good research and figure out how to vet people that you should trust and you should look to as your expertise. So tonight we're going to look to two primary sources, and I'll introduce you to them as we go along. But people that have really thought through these issues well and have helped me understand what I understand about the issue. And at the end of this night, you can tell me whether I understood enough to help you understand a little bit more about this subject. So what we have here is Socrates. And this is when Socrates was condemned for asking too many questions. Now, you've heard there's no such thing as a stupid question, except the one that's not asked. Well, he proved that too many questions can be a bad thing, right? And so he was actually condemned for undermining the morals of the younger generation. And his condemnation was to drink hemlock. And so what this picture relates to is all of the people around him being in disbelief and dismay that something wrong was happening to this man who was asking questions. And so we have this, way back to the Greeks, we have this sense of right and wrong and how to discern what should be morally acceptable. So tonight we're going to look at some topics that make sense to me, and this is kind of the way I thought about them when I was starting to think about this topic. So there are several contingent factors. There are things on which morality depends. That's what contingent has to do with. So the first one has to do with consciousness. All of you right now are thinking. I don't know what you're thinking, but you know what you're thinking. And nobody in the world can tell what you're thinking, but there's no doubt in your mind that that thought is real. Where does that consciousness come from? Can it be explained by materialism? We're going to ask that question. So consciousness has to be real if we can make choices, which leads to free will. We have to have free will in order for consciousness and any action that you take be a choice that's either right or wrong. So we need consciousness and free will. I think we're going to be able to demonstrate that we all have a sense of what's right and wrong. So we have this internal conscience. Conscience has a universal general direction. We don't agree on everything about what's right and wrong, but we all have a sense of what's right and wrong. Where did that come from? And where we tend to align as humans and agree on those things, why would we be in agreement? And then morality is a choice of a moral agent, or it's irrelevant. If you as a moral or as a human being don't have the choice to make a good or bad decision about your actions, then morality is irrelevant. But if you have choices, if you have free will, if you have consciousness, if those things are all in play, then we have morality that is relevant to us and that we need to really be thinking through. So what is morality? Well, this is a dictionary definition. It's a particular system of values and principles of conduct, especially one held by a specified person or society. I'm going to paraphrase that, and as used tonight, I'm going to say it's an obligation to behave toward other individuals in a proper way. And so we're going to flesh that out as we go along. But we're going to start with a good old friend, Mr. Charles Darwin. In Darwin's autobiography, he said some very interesting things about his own understanding of our first topic, which is consciousness. Consciousness was a challenge for Darwin, and so we're just going to read what he said about that. And we'll pick two key passages, pages 92 and 93 of his autobiography, and it starts out like this. He says, another source of conviction in the existence of God connected with reason and not with feelings impresses me as having much more weight. This follows from the extreme difficulty, or rather impossibility, of conceiving this immense and wonderful universe, including man with his capacity of looking far backwards and far into futurity, as the result of blind chance or necessity. So he was basically saying blind chance and necessity doesn't really seem to make sense to him as a source of consciousness. When thus reflecting, I feel compelled to look to a first cause, having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man, and I deserve to be called a theist. Now, does that surprise you about Darwin? That at this point he thought of himself as they ought to call him a theist? Well, he goes on. He said, this conclusion was strong in my mind about the time, as far as I can remember, when I wrote The Origin of Species. And it is since that time that it has very gradually, in many fluctuations, become weaker. But then arises the doubt. Can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? In other words, if the mind is an accident, can we trust it? That's a question that has that bothered Darwin, and it has bothered philosophers ever since, probably before that as well. But if this computer was cobbled together from a bunch of parts from a junkyard, and I used it to calculate whether my checkbook is balanced, could I trust the result? Probably not. And that's what Darwin was saying. So we'll come back to him, but let's leave him there for right now. This issue of consciousness and how it arose, could it be explained by materialistic conditions, drove a wedge between him and his co-developer, or co-discoverer, they call it, of the theory of evolution, and that's Alfred Russel Wallace. So Alfred Russel Wallace comes along. He came up with the idea about the same time as Darwin. That's an interesting story we won't go into. But Alfred Russel Wallace, a little over 10 years later, this is 1893, he writes this book that kind of summarizes his disagreement with Darwin on the issue of, can materialism explain consciousness? It's called The World of Life. It's a fascinating book. I've read most of it. A manifestation of creative power, directive mind, and ultimate purpose. So he's looking outside the material world and saying there is direction and there's purpose injected into this materialistic world. And the subtitle of the book is this, there's a quote on the cover of the book, every plant, whether beech, lily, or seaweed, has its origin in a cell which does not contain the ulterior product, but which is endowed with or accompanied by a force. So he's got this outside force which provokes and directs the formation of all later developments. Here is the fact, or rather the mystery, as to the production of the several species with their special organs. So he saw direction from an outside entity into the material world to give direction. And he and Darwin parted company not on good terms. So we're going to look to our first expert. And I'm going to do these a little out of order because of the way that the experts that I've chosen group their thoughts together. So as we go along, I'll kind of tell you where we are. So we're going to go right down to this idea of humans have an internal conscience, and the conscience has a universal general direction. So for that, we're going to look at a guy named J. Warner Wallace. Now, have any of you heard of J. Warner Wallace? Okay. So a cold case homicide detective, for those of you who haven't heard of him. He works on cold case homicides. He's now retired. For several years after he retired, he would do testimonies and continue working cases that he had worked as a detective. One of his claims to fame is that he's been on I think it's Dateline more times than any other detective in history, because he's come up with these ingenious ways of finding out who did these cases. Sometimes there's not even a body. They don't have a body, but he's been able to convict people based on patterns of evidence and so on. So he's looked at these issues as a materialist who eventually was drawn by the evidence to become a Christian. One of his books is called God's Crime Scene, and he has this interesting thing. It's going to sound like a tangent, but trust me, we'll get back to it. We'll get back to the morality issue. So he has this idea of inside the room or outside the room. So if you come onto a crime scene, let's say there's a dead body, can you explain everything that you need to explain about this body becoming dead? Because living things like us don't just spontaneously die. Usually there's a cause, right? And so can you explain all the causal agents by what's inside the room? If you can, then it could be one of several things. If you can't, you have to look outside for some agent who came into the room and did this thing. So for example, the possibilities for this guy dying are natural death, accidental death, suicide, or homicide. Now that's it. Are there any other things you can think of that might be causal general ideas that could cause a dead body? That's kind of it. Okay, so as we look at the evidence, we're going to say, okay, so I'm going to introduce a piece of evidence, and you're going to tell me which of these things can we take off the list and narrow it down to what we're looking for, okay? So first of all, he's face down. Can we take any of these four things off the list yet? Not yet, okay. Now, there's a pool of blood. Can we take anything off the list yet?
Maybe natural death.
Okay.
Yeah,
so natural death generally doesn't occur with a pool of blood, right? It might be old age, might be, this guy doesn't look that old, so yeah, I think we can probably take natural death off the table. All right, so we're going to add to the evidence, and now we have an exit wound. So we have a pool of blood, we have an exit wound from a gunshot, looks like, probably. Can we take anything off the list yet? Could still be accidental, could be any of these things, right? Okay, now we find a gun. So the gun's in the room now, okay? So can we take anything off the list because we found the gun there? We've still got three things in play, right? Okay. All right, so now we find a suicide note. Can we take anything off the list?
Well, the accidental ought to be taken off.
Maybe. Or maybe he was just thinking about it but didn't really intend to. But it's becoming clearer that maybe it wasn't an accident, right? We're not 100%, but looking pretty good for not an accidental death. We'll keep it on for right now. Okay, so now we find multiple exit wounds. Okay? Now can we take anything off the list? It's getting a little clearer. We could probably take accidental death off the list. Okay. And now we have foreign footprints, i.e. the guy's got shoes on. Those are barefoot, bloody footprints. Can we take anything else off the list? Suicide. Yeah, most likely. Now, it could be somebody came on the guy and walked away after finding him dead in bare feet, but it's looking much more like we have a homicide. And when you have a homicide, as Wallace would say, a homicide turns curiosity into urgency. And so now you're going in a specific direction. So when we look at these kind of clues, certain things can be eliminated, certain things will draw us into a further investigation. And so we want to look at those things, foreign footprints, fingerprints that don't belong to the victim, maybe a gun that was registered to somebody else, etc. So we're looking outside the room now for somebody to explain those kind of situations. And so we really are using the evidence to go through these and determine which one makes sense. We can do the same thing with other topics. And so Wallace's book talks about the issue of morality in some degree, in some detail. And so he looks at inside the box, inside of the room, inside the box or outside the box. In this case, the box is the universe. Okay? So the question is, what can we deduce looking inside the universe versus outside? And so he lists 8 different things. We won't do all of them tonight. Beginning of the universe, fine-tuning of the universe, origin of life, the appearance of design in biology, the existence of consciousness, the existence of free will, transcendent moral truths, and the presence of evil. Now, again, some of these are not really related to our search for morality. So we can kind of look inside the box, we can look outside the box, but we don't really care about several of them for tonight. So all those on the right side we're not going to talk about. And the presence of evil and injustice might be related to morality, but we're going to put that one aside too, and kind of limit ourselves to these 3 remaining issues, and that is consciousness, free will, and transcendent moral truths, which is where we started. So that's what we're going to focus on, and we're going to say, can it be explained from what's inside the universe or not? And so we'll start with, think about this. We have issues of, 3 things, stealing, lying, or killing. And the question is there ever a time when it's okay to do those things? And Wallace would say, what about if it's to protect one's own life or to protect the life of an innocent? In those situations, would it be justified to steal, lie, or kill? Given the right circumstances, yes, could be justified. What about here? If we add this term, for the fun of it, can you think of a situation where stealing, lying, or killing for the fun of it is going to be morally justified? Probably not. Okay. All right. So we're going to let J. Warner Wallace talk about that issue, and then we'll kind of summarize. And again, I'm calling on my expert witnesses at this point to help bolster the idea.
We're going to talk about the moral evidence. The moral evidence. I can tell you, I spent a couple of years working gangs in South Central Los Angeles area, and I met a lot of interesting people doing that. And one of these interesting people was a gangster who ended up torturing a fellow gangster because that fellow, not his gang, a different clique, so it was another gangster across town, that he ended up torturing because that gangster had kind of said some suggestive things to his sister. He took offense to that. When we finally took him to custody and we talked about this with him, he didn't see anything wrong with what he had done. As a matter of fact, he suggested this was really the law of the streets, that if he had done that to his sister, he would have expected that guy to come and do that to him. For this guy named Jesse, he really felt like this was part of a moral code that was entirely appropriate. He accepted this as proper, virtuous behavior given the law of the street that he actually lived. Now, I will tell you that even in his situation, there were some people who reigned over his moral law. So, for example, he would never do anything to break the law of his clique, his gangsters, his fellow gangsters. They had a moral code, and Jesse knew that he had to bend his knee to that moral code. And even though they might have been gangsters living in our city, they also knew they would get a ticket if they parked someplace on the city they shouldn't park. So even that gangsters, they would say, hey, in that gang, they would not break the city municipal codes because they didn't want to have their cars towed. So there's still an overarching authority even over the gang, and the gang is overarching over Jesse. And in the city of Los Angeles, I mean, we have to kind of bend our knee to several laws and restrictions that are offered by the state of California. So there's an overarching hierarchy of law from the state of California that's over the city of Los Angeles, which is over the gangster group that Jesse was a part of. And you can see how you could extend this out. And see, there's a hierarchy of law. There's national laws that govern all the states. Some people would argue that there's international laws that govern nations. I get that. The question is, how far does this hierarchy go? Does it stop at some point? Where are moral laws grounded? Can these be explained by staying inside the room of the universe? Or is there some better explanation for the overarching moral laws? Look, to begin with, we would say that there are some objective moral truths. And if you wonder what those are, simply add the expression "for the fun of it" behind any crime. So, for example, you might say it's okay to lie to achieve a greater end. If I've got to lie in order to steal, to prevent 1 million people from being destroyed by a terrorist, if I need to steal in order to steal a code so he can't push the button to destroy 1 million people, well, I can justify this in some way. But if you put the expression "for the fun of it" behind lying, suddenly you've discovered an overarching, objective, moral truth claim that is true for all of us. It's never okay, never has been okay, to lie for the fun of it, to steal for the fun of it, to kill for the fun of it. Put the "for the fun of it" on your sentence, and suddenly you've discovered a number of objective, transcendent moral claims, moral truths, moral obligations.
Okay, so again, I'm just going to use him to kind of reiterate what we're talking about as we go along. But the first thing is what seems right. Now, the gang member Jesse, he's doing what seems right to him, correct? Does it seem right? Do you think it would seem right to everybody at all times and all places? Probably not. So that's the problem, is what about when there's a disagreement regarding what's right and wrong? So if there is difference of opinion allowed on what's right and wrong, that is not a universally acceptable moral standard. Well, there's another way to look at what's right and wrong, and maybe it's what's determined by the government. We have laws, they pass laws. That's all they do, unfortunately, is pass laws. But is that a good way to determine what's right and wrong? Why?
You can pass bad laws.
I'm sorry?
You can pass bad laws.
You can pass bad laws. And of course, we always have the ultimate example of were the Nazis right to pass the laws that they did, and why or why not? That's a discussion question we won't take time to discuss right now. I think it's fairly intuitively obvious to an intelligent audience. What about, could it be the product of biology? What's wrong with that? The question is, can material forces generate what philosophers would say is generate an ought? So because something is the case, does it demonstrate what ought to be the case? Is there a biological necessity for morals being right or wrong? Well, that leads to another question, and that is, some people will say, well, the things that are right are what causes the most good for the most number of people. Sometimes they define that as human flourishing. And what's the problem with that definition? It could easily lead to survival of the fittest, right? The strong over the weak. So what kind of survival is preferred? Is it the strong being the survivors? Is that what's best? Or is it the biggest number, even if they're living in abject poverty? How do we determine human flourishing? And so that becomes problematic to use that as your standard. And again, the stronger, the bad behavior can bring about a survival advantage. We've seen that with the Nazis until they were taken down. We see that with Jesse's gang members until they're confronted with a force that's greater than they were, in this case, the police department. So the next thing we want to make a case about is that morality has a direction. There's always a someone to whom, or some entity to whom the moral obligation applies. And so morality implies obligation. And we'll let J. Warner Wallace talk to us about this for a moment.
You don't have moral obligations to inanimate physical objects. All moral obligations are between persons. So whoever is the source of these moral laws, that has to be a person. You are also not morally obligated to physics. But moral obligations drive us to look for the moral person that is the foundation for moral law. If we can't stay inside the room to describe the source for morality from persons or from groups of persons, there does seem to be one other option that some people have gravitated toward, and that is it perhaps a product of our biology? Is it perhaps, as Sam Harris would say, writing about this, the neuroscientist and philosopher who's also an atheist, that this is simply a matter of our biology, our common, overarching human desire to flourish. Well, okay, so is human flourishing, human well-being, the overarching source of moral law? Okay, what do you mean by flourishing? Do you mean survival? Because clearly, I've seen people behave very, very poorly in history as groups or as individuals, and it has actually aided in their survival. You can behave atrociously and improve your survival chances. But I think most people will say, well, yeah, but that's not human flourishing. There's a certain kind of survival that we would say is well, is good, is virtuous, is aids well-being. It aids your flourishing. But there's the problem. If you're going to say there's a certain kind of survival, you have to start with a moral notion that you haven't earned yet. You have to start, because remember, if all moral notions are simply aiding your survival mode of flourishing, a certain kind of survival, well, now you're stealing a moral idea that precedes your idea of flourishing. So it's kind of cheap, if you think about it, to say that it's human flourishing that drives our moral behavior, because you've got an idea in your mind about what that is. And your idea is full of moral content, but if moral content comes from flourishing, it can't precede flourishing to describe it. Do you see the problem? So when we try to stay inside the room of the universe to describe where objective, transcendent moral law comes from, where moral truth comes from, most of these explanations will not get it done. Well, none of them will get it done, and none of them also will point back to the person to whom we feel obligated. If there are objective, transcendent, moral laws and obligations, who is the objective, transcendent, moral lawgiver to whom we feel obligated?
Okay, so we're going to flesh that out a little bit more toward the end of the talk, but for right now, I want to move on to this idea of obligation to who and not what, and ask the question, what is the logical entity to whom we are morally obligated?
It can't be a what, because we're not morally obligated to what's, we're only morally obligated to who's. The best explanation for the moral truths that we feel press upon us inside the room is a lawgiver, a personal lawgiver that's outside the room. And the laws we feel, the obligations we feel in the room are not his creation, his willy-nilly creation, and they're not also the things that he just recognizes and tells us. No, instead they are a reflection of his holy moral character. An all-powerful God has the ability to eliminate moral imperfection. And if he can do that, he becomes a standard we can trust and stand on. So now we've looked at our evidence, right? In the room, we've started to develop a suspect description, given all the cosmological evidence, the biological evidence, all the mental evidence, and now one piece of the first half of the moral evidence. And what we see is we're looking for, again, that all-powerful first cause that's a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, that is the designer that fine-tunes the universe, authors life, is responsible for the design we see in life, who creates as a mind freely beings in its image that also are minds who act freely and feel morally obligated because we have an author. We have a reflection of God's holy nature in the universe that we sense, even if we don't believe. We sense that and we respond accordingly. The best explanation, once again, is outside the room.
Okay, so just recapping briefly what he just kind of summarized. So what explains moral inclinations? We all have this idea of right and wrong. Is it survival of the fittest? Is it survival advantage? Is it human flourishing? We can pretty much eliminate those as universals. They might be in the moment, you might think about those things, but they're not going to carry the weight long term for making a society-wide decision about what's right and wrong. So instead, what have we established? Well, everyone has moral inclinations. Okay? Everyone has moral obligations. We feel like we owe our parents, our friends, our gang member, some entity, we owe them a certain standard of behavior. Moral obligations are to a who, not to a what. So that's kind of where we landed at this point. So as we go along, this is my initial outline of the points that we're going to cover. And I want to explain, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, my job is not to convince you that I'm right on all these things. I know I'm right. You don't have to know that, but I'm convinced I'm right. So the question is, I want to help you think about these things and expose you to what I've concluded, whether it's right or wrong, you can decide. So as we go along, I will kind of keep track of what we've covered. So first of all, we said humans have an internal conscience. We also said that conscience has a universal general direction, and that morality is the choice of an agent, a person with free will and consciousness, or it's irrelevant. So we've gone that far. We'll go through some of the others as we go. So we'll have questions at the end, but I'll just kind of keep charging along unless anybody totally lost at this point. Are you with me? You're okay. All right. I am going to take credit for having covered the morality definition too, so I get credit for that one. Okay. All right. So moving along. So I want to introduce our next expert witness. This is Dr. Michael Egner that will be doing the next couple of videos. Michael Egner is a neurosurgeon. He is the head of pediatric neurosurgery at Stony Brook University in New York. And he's done over 7,000 brain surgeries. And so when you're doing brain surgeries, one of the things that you end up with is some very interesting psychological and consciousness issues that go along with brain surgery. So he's going to address several questions. Were any of you at the Discovery Institute conference? So did you hear his talk? So yeah, so this will be familiar to you. It'll be a review for some of you. For the rest of you, it'll be pretty amazing stuff. Some of the questions he's going to address include, is the brain the organ of the mind? Does the soul exist as something separate from the brain? Interesting question. Are near-death experiences real? Is the mind a kind of computational machine? He talks about that. We won't get into that too much. What functions does the brain have? If it's separate from consciousness, what does the brain control and what doesn't it control? And what is the soul, and is the soul immortal? So these are some of the questions he's going to get into. Pretty fascinating stuff. He was named one of New York's best doctors by New York Magazine in 2005. He's quite a guy, very personable, and he's going to help us think through these issues. We'll start with this first question: is the brain the organ of the mind? And so that's where he's going to start with this first segment.
Some of the most interesting work along this line has been done by Roger Sperry and his colleagues. Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this work. Back in the mid-20th century, an operation was developed for people who would have a seizure in one hemisphere of the brain that would spread to the other hemisphere. And these were catastrophic seizures that were very difficult to control. So what Sperry, an operation that was developed, not by Sperry, but by others, was to cut the brain in half, essentially, so that if a seizure started in one half of the brain, it couldn't spread to the other half, and that made the seizures much easier to control and much milder. It was called a corpus callosotomy, and we still do that surgery today. So the hemispheres of the brain are functionally disconnected. And Sperry, who was a neuroscientist, realized that you could study what each hemisphere does because they're disconnected. So he did a lot of wonderful work. The left hemisphere controls speech, the right hemisphere controls spatial orientation, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. But one thing that he noticed, and I've noticed too, is that people who've had their brains cut in half are pretty normal people. As you meet these people, the brains are cut in half, and they're walking and talking, they feel normal. They have less seizures than they used to have. It would be the same thing as if someone just took a chainsaw and cut the laptop in half, and it still worked just fine. Like, there's something odd about this. The follow-up research on that is something that still gives me chills, and I learned about this decades ago, and I think it's among the most fascinating results in cognitive neuroscience. Justine Surgeon was a researcher at McGill in Montreal, worked about 20 years after Sperry. And she studied people with split brain surgery. And what she did was she found a way to present pictures of things, like pictures of arrows, to each hemisphere separately at the same time. So she put arrows up that the right hemisphere would see one arrow, the left hemisphere would see the other arrow, but no part of the brain saw both arrows. One half saw one arrow, the other half saw the other arrow. And she asked the people, are the arrows pointing in the same direction or not? And they always got it right. But how could they compare arrows when no part of the brain saw both arrows? So she concluded that there was something in the mind that wasn't in the brain. Yair Pinto has furthered that research in which he tells stories to split brain patients, where the first half of the story is presented to one hemisphere. The second half of the story is presented to the other hemisphere. But you don't understand the story unless you see both. A good example would be if the left hemisphere can see a baseball, and the right hemisphere can see a broken window. So Pinto would ask the patient, what happened? And the patients always answered, the baseball broke the window. But no part of the brain saw both the baseball and the window. So there's something in the mind that's not in the brain.
So for those of you with your brains intact, does that blow your mind? So I meant to ask him later, but I didn't think of it in time. But I think what they did was they would show like an image in one eye, but block the other, and then show the image, maybe simultaneously with the arrows. But only one eye would see one, and the other eye would see the other. And of course, the vision we know now, right vision is controlled. I think I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a lot of things. This is one of them. But I think one side controls one eye vision-wise, and the other side controls the other. And so if you're presenting these two things and they're somehow connected, but they're not connected in the brain, the mind is someplace else. That does blow my mind. And the same thing with the pictures, where you can tell the story. So it does control seizures, but it shows that the mind is something greater than the physical connection. Something else he talked about, and I don't think there's a segment on this, but there are a number of patients he had where there was a significant portion of the brain missing, as you can see in the pictures here. And some of these, there is some mental cognition and some disability. Others, there's most of the brain missing due to birth defect or whatever, and the person could be a high-functioning normal human. He mentioned this gal Cindy, who was I think at the time that he was reporting on it, she was a high-performing academic, solid high school student, living a relatively normal life. So the mind is greater than just the physical matter that's in your brain. So we'll let him continue with the next series of stories.
Adrian Owen is a researcher, I think he's currently in Indiana, he was at Cambridge in England, did a fascinating study in patients in persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is the deepest level of coma. It's just a step above brain death. And it happens when people have had very severe brain injuries from a lack of oxygen or from motor vehicle accidents. And it's called vegetative because it's been assumed that these people are basically vegetables, meaning that they have no mind. They're just a body and there's no mind left. Some of you may recall the Terry Schiavo stuff that went on about 20 years ago. She was in persistent vegetative state. What Owen did is he put patients in MRI machines and did functional MRI imaging that shows brain activity. And he would ask them to think about things with a headset. He'd say, think about walking across the room, or think about your family, or think about playing tennis. And they would show patterns of brain activation in their very damaged brain. And he then did that with normal volunteers and found the patterns were identical, implying that they were understanding what he was talking about. And then what he did, he was very clever, he asked the same questions, but he mixed up the words, so they didn't make any sense. Instead of think about walking across the room, he'd say, room across walking about think. Doesn't make any sense. And the brain was silent. So these people were understanding the questions he was asking, even though their brains were practically destroyed. And he actually found, he and other people have replicated his work, that about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state show clear evidence of being able to communicate. There are people who can do mathematics in persistent vegetative state. You ask them, what's 9 plus 6? You count, when you hit 15, the brain lights up. There are people who can tell their family histories. Is your brother's name George? Brain light up. So you can communicate with people in the deepest level of coma in many cases.
So that's kind of groundbreaking right there, isn't it? The idea that people who are in comas or appear to be unconscious may well be there in some sense that we can't, that they can't process verbal cues to let us know they're there. They may not be able to move their eyelids or their hands, but their brains are, their souls, their spirits are still present. And have some connection with the brain such that brain activity can be recorded even in that situation. That's, again, mind-blowing. So they can think and answer complex questions. And then you ask the question, what are the implications? You know, when we look at how we treated Terry Schiavo and others in our lives, perhaps, who are conscious, and we're talking about in their room, what are we going to do when they pass away? And instead we should be reading them meaningful passages from Scripture or other sources that would help them where they are spiritually at that moment and the things that most concern them with what's happening to them. So I'll bet you didn't think we were going to talk about persistent vegetative states tonight, right? Well, here's something else you didn't think we were going to talk about, and that's near-death experiences, because it has a relevance to what is consciousness. So we're going to go there next.
Near-death experiences are sort of the paradigmatic example of a separation between the soul or the mind and the brain. And while some near-death experiences may be not genuine, they may be hallucinations or whatever, there's no doubt that there is a real core of real experiences. They're probably about 20% of near-death experiences are veridical, meaning they can be checked. The person knows things that occurred when they were dead, things that went on inside the room, etc. The probably most famous near-death experience was Pam Reynolds, who was an aneurysm patient, operated on in 1991. And in order to safely operate on the aneurysm, her surgeon had to stop her heart after cooling her body down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that gave him about 30 minutes to fix the aneurysm. He drained all the blood out of her brain, fixed the aneurysm, and then rewarmed her and started her heart again. And she survived and did very well, actually. She said that in the recovery room, she said, I watched the operation. He said, what? She said, you were brain dead. You couldn't possibly watch the operation. So she said that as soon as her brain went dead, she popped out of her body, floated up to the ceiling, watched the surgery. She said that her vision was amazingly accurate, and it was a beautiful scene. And then she told him what he talked about during the surgery. She told him what the instruments looked like and what music was playing in the room during the surgery. And things like this have happened a number of times. So in my view, there's no question that some near-death experiences are very real. The other thing that for me is very convincing is that people have surveyed the literature. There are thousands of examples of this in the literature, where people go down a tunnel and they see loved ones and relatives at the other end of the tunnel. Nobody in the medical literature who's had a near-death experience has ever seen a living person at the other end of the tunnel. It's not like you kind of watch your mother and your mother's still alive and you see her at the other end of the tunnel. Only dead people are at the other end of the tunnel, including people that you didn't know were dead. There are a number of examples of people who were in car accidents where someone in the car died and they didn't know the person died because they were critically injured also, and they saw that person on the other side of the tunnel, but not people in the car who didn't die.
So the conclusion we start drawing here is that...
Near-death experiences...
Whoops. I think we just did that one. Sorry. The conclusion we draw from this video is that, again, consciousness is not tied strictly to the physical brain. It's a real entity. You're experiencing it right now, but it is not connected only to your brain. Now, it is connected to your brain in some way, because you do have those certain things that he said light up on the MRI when the right questions are asked. So there is brain activity that is stimulated with some kind of connection with your consciousness, but they're not the same thing. They're not co-equal. They are not the same entity, physical and spiritual, together. They are separate with connection. So we don't know how that works, but we know that it does seem to be the case. So what are the brain's functions? Well, the brain is the organ of movement, perception, memory, and emotion. So the brain has significant interaction with the consciousness on these levels. So if you choose to move your arm, your brain is commanding the arm to do that, but it's your will, your conscious will, that makes the choice to direct the brain to do that. Same thing with emotions. There are a lot of things that are related to emotions, from hormones and enzymes and all those kinds. There are some connections physically, but it's not the same thing. So your emotions, and he'll talk about this in a minute, your emotions can say, I want that piece of cake, and if you have more self-control than I do, you say no to your physical desire, right? Okay, there is no organ of the intellect and the will. And that's the conclusion that he draws from these near-death experiences and persistent vegetative states. And then he asks this question, is the soul immortal? And can a spirit die? Can a spirit stop existing? If the body stops, does the spirit stop? And so he defines death, and he says death is a disintegration of matter and a separation from the spirit or soul or mind. So I would say death is where your spirit separates from your physical body. Life, on the other hand, is a union. It's a unity of your spirit with your physical body. So you're alive because your spirit, your mind, and we make a big deal about mind, soul, spirit, all these different discriminators. It's all kind of you. And whatever that you is what we're talking about right now. When that you entity separates from your physical body, you're either having an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience, or you're dead, okay? And when you're separated from that entity that is walking around with you most days when you're having a good day, okay? Life, so then, is the integration of life with the spiritual force of the soul. So then he asks some questions about the soul, and he, just to paraphrase, we won't do the video and all of this stuff, but he says that the soul knows, loves, and animates. It is the universal experience, and all neuroscience confirms that that is the case. The soul has no parts, and he gives some citations and papers. The soul has no location, because we know that it can be separated from the body, even while the body is still alive, or in this situation where the person was brain dead, it was separated from the body, but then became unified again. The soul is not in time. Near-death experiences seem to indicate that you can have a different experience of time during that situation that you're separated. And the soul seems to abide beyond a physical limitation. So those are the conclusions that the people that interact with these folks have come to universally in the literature. When we compare these attributes with what we as Christians would call God, we find some amazing similarities. So God's image is defined by some of these characteristics, or described by some of these characteristics. God is infinite spirit. He is knowledge, love, and power. The human soul knows, loves, and acts, and God does that as well. We are all created in His image, which is a huge, momentous concept, which has generated in cultures that have a high sense of morality the way that we treat the least among us. So how do we treat our elderly, our near and dear to my heart, right? Our elderly, our infants, our frail, our disabled. How do we treat those people? If we're made in God's image, and all of us are made if we are made in that image, that all of those people who some have characterized as less and have said they are the other, whether it is because of physical attributes or race or religion or anything else, those people that we consider less than us are made in God's image and are every bit as valuable to God as we are, who value ourselves so highly. So where are we? What have we covered? What can we check off the list, right? The next thing I think we can check off the list is that consciousness is not explained by materialism. So we've covered that, whether you agree with it or not. And then let's talk about free will. That'd be the next thing we need to talk about is how do we know anything about free will? is there such a thing as a free choice? Or are we deterministic? Are we just a series of dominoes that are going to tip over at the right provocation? And so he's going to address this next.
Wilder Penfield also studied free will, and he did a very interesting study. During these awake brain operations, he would stimulate the surface of the patient's brain, and if you stimulate the right place, you can make them do things, like make them raise their arm. He would ask them during the surgery to occasionally raise their arm themselves without him stimulating them. And you can't feel your brain. Your brain has no sensory things, and the patients are under surgical drapes, so they can't see what he's doing. And he would ask them, when your arm goes up, I want you to tell me whether you did it or whether I did it. And they always got it right. Hundreds of thousands of trials of this in 1,100 patients. No one ever missed it. No one ever got it wrong. And he concluded then that he couldn't find any place in the brain that simulated free will. That free will wasn't in the brain. That you could always tell, this is my will. This is not someone doing it to me. So free will is not a brain function. Benjamin Libet did probably the most famous research on free will. And what Libet found, and it would take a while to go into details about how he did his experiments, they were quite ingenious. But he would record electrical signals from the scalp, and these are people who haven't had any surgery, they're just normal volunteers. And what he found was that when you decide to do something simple, there tends to be a spike in brain activity that happens about a half second before you decide. Like if you're going to turn on a light switch. About a half second before you turn on the light switch, your brain spikes. And that's before you're aware that you're going to turn it on. So that seems at first glance that everything is driven by your brain. Your brain makes you do it, and you don't really have any free will. It's all just chemicals driving you to do things. But he was a very clever researcher, and what he did is he asked people to veto your decision. That is, that when you're about to flip the switch, say, no, I'm not going to do it. I've changed my mind. And the veto didn't have a spike in the brain. So he said, it's not so much that he showed there was free will, but they showed there was free won't. That is that your brain, and he commented, he was a religious man, and he said, this is the traditional religious way of understanding human motivation, that we're hit with temptations from our brain, but we have the free choice to do it or not. Because the free choice to do it or not did not have any new brain activity at all. It was independent of the brain. So the brain keeps hitting you with these things, have that extra piece of cake. But you can say yes or no, and you can't blame your brain.
Okay, so again, summarizing, there does seem to be empirical evidence that personal will is not the same as brain activity. The implications of that are we're responsible for our actions, and we can't, again, blame physical forces or, the devil made me do it. We chose to do those things. So sometimes we don't like those implications. You may not like the implications of the fact that the brain and the soul and spirit are separate. The you is not the same as your physical brain, but that doesn't make the conclusion wrong. It just makes you think more deeply about it, right? And other people have pushed back. Here's an article that somebody wrote, and Egner wrote a peer-reviewed article, Does Brain Surgery Prove That Free Will Isn't Real? My fellow neurosurgeon Theodore Schwartz is mistaken in thinking free will is an illusion. It is quite real. So I mean, there's peer-reviewed literature that people are doing based on this research. So if free will does not exist, then you can't choose to debate it with us today. You can't ask any questions if free will doesn't exist. And if free will doesn't exist, you wouldn't know it. So if you make an argument that free will doesn't exist, you're basically refuting your own argument. So what does Scripture say about free will? Is there such a thing in a theological sense? We're not going to read all these verses, but I just have a kind of a cross-section of Scripture references that show that God does give us things to choose about. And I'll highlight one verse on this next Next, the one at the top here, and it says, "This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that your children, you and your children may live." And in 2 Kings 18:32, same thing. Choose life and not death. So what is it that we're choosing if we choose life? We'll get there in a moment. But the point here is that free will does exist, I'm convinced at least, and that it's really genuine. So we do have choices about our free will. So summarizing what Wallace talked about earlier, we won't go into detail, but you can look at each of these things that he talked about. I was going to take some time and go through this, but we're a little bit behind where I thought we should be. So he eliminates all these things, illusions. Could it be just brute facts that force us into free will? And again, we'll just kind of run through these real quickly, but is it purely subjective? Do we each have our own choice about what's free will? This is an important one. This overvalues what we feel and eliminates the moral debate altogether and leads to moral selfishness and basically prioritizing yourself over everything else. Could it be simply relative to groups? Then it depends on how the group interprets things and the group alignment as opposed to a universal truth, because of biological facts that assumes a moral definition of well-being that we talked about earlier is not adequate. And so you end up with the only thing in this chart that makes sense is that there is a transcendent, outside the universe, outside the box, source of moral authority against which we have to, or with which we have to resolve what is right and wrong. And whether I resolve it or not doesn't change the nature of right and wrong. You know, this whole thing, if morality is objective, then it doesn't matter whether I like it or not. It doesn't matter whether I agree with it or not. What matters is whether it's in line with, in our case, in Christian's case, is it God's character? And so God's character determines what is right and wrong. And that's where we go to determine ultimately what is to be the choice that is the moral choice. So the character of God, again, bringing that back into the picture, if we look at God, he is outside time, space, and matter, which means he's timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. He's powerful, omnipotent, he is intelligent, omniscient, he is personal, he makes choices in sequences of events as they occur. He chose to bring the universe into existence at some point. We know from the Big Bang hypothesis, which is really a very poor description of God in an orderly manner, rolling out the universe such that it could be stable and balanced and have all the physical forces. That's a separate lecture. But we know scientifically that there was a point in time where that occurred. We don't know exactly where that was. Lots of theoretical ideas about that. But we know that he made a choice at a point in time to do that. He's loving, which means he's other-centered. He's jealous, which means he allows alignment with reality. This is one that is worth picking at if you want to ask me about that later. But his jealousy means that if we're going to go a way that is not helpful because it's not aligned with the reality he's given us, it's loving for him to bring us back to, and he jealously guards us when we get away from the right path. He is merciful. He's not giving people what they deserve. He's just. He gives the rebellious what they do deserve. So the question becomes, does justice exist? What do you think? Does justice actually exist in the greater sense of things? If it doesn't, then these two are equal. And that's an implication that does not seem reasonable. So we know that there's a difference between individual actions in the big scheme of things. So morality is real. Consciousness, in order for morality to be real, consciousness has to be real, free will has to be real and genuine, some standard for moral actions has to exist. And so because of that, of what we've found out tonight, the soul is not physical. Consciousness is real and separate from physical entities. Humans have free will, and morality is an obligation. These are all essential parts of what makes morality a real thing. Morality is towards someone outside the room, because morality towards someone inside the room is that group affinity. That doesn't work. And morality is universally experienced because we all have a conscience. Again, sometimes that conscience needs to be educated or reformed or shaped, but we all have it in that sense. So then the question is, what is the only truly logical choice for that someone? And as a Christian, I would say that that someone is outside the box of the universe, and it's the transcendent moral lawgiver. So again, just a quick list of some conclusions. Morality is objective rather than subjective. An objective moral law requires an objective standard of morality. The objective standard of morality must be God, and we showed that through going through the other entities on that chart, that they don't work. So if morality were not absolute, then there would be no basis for suggesting that human civilization has made moral progress in the last 4 millennia. We may as well revert back to Mesopotamian ethics. Anybody want to go there? So we can't say there's moral progress because there hasn't been that much moral progress, but there's been some, and we want to take advantage of living in that world. So basically, we've covered all these issues, and we're next going to go to contingent factors of concluding these things. And so let me. There's one phrase we didn't cover yet, and that is it irrelevant? If morality is the choice of a moral agent, or it is irrelevant. If we don't have the ability, the consciousness, the free will to make a moral choice, then this whole talk about morality, you just wasted your night. Because to be relevant, it has to have these components. And it seems to have all those components, and that's where I say that morality does come from, not from the material world, but from outside the box. And so we'll conclude kind of where we started, and that's with Mr. Darwin. We left Mr. Darwin where he was struggling with this idea of, can the mind that is physical be trusted in big moral issues? And he says that he wants to be considered, that he thinks it's reasonable to consider himself a theist, but then he also goes on to say this. He kind of moves on, he meanders a bit. He says, I cannot pretend to throw the least light on such abstruse problems. The mystery of the beginning of all changes, of all things, is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. So he goes right up to the brink of evidentially realizing that consciousness is not physical, that it can't be explained through evolution, and then he backs away. And he says, I'm just going to ignore it and be an agnostic, where I can't. An agnostic means you can't, you don't believe it's either knowable or you can't prove what the truth is. So he steps away from making a conclusion. So again, the final verse that we will emphasize is this verse about choosing life. We are given a choice to do that. So what does it mean to choose life? Well, in the New Testament, we're told, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So my question to you is, do you have life? Have you made that choice? Have you chosen to align yourself with the giver of all moral laws? And in 1 John it says, and this is the testimony, God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. So the key to life is the Son of God. And the next verse is, I love the next part where it says, I write this to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. He wants us to be confident of that. That's part of his loving nature as well. So we will now open for discussion if you think it'd be okay. That's a moral choice, right? So what questions do you have at this point?
Let's first give it up for Rick.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So what questions? I'm sure I've raised something in your minds, and you're now welcome to pummel me, realizing that my role is not to prove it to you, but just to tell you what I believe and let you think. So what do you think? That's all I got.
So let's see, about the like society and like flourishing, if someone like posits that that we, as like, ape people or whatever, want to have that dopamine, we want to have happiness, and so we're and then we like, because of like some kind of a hive/community, communities do better than individuals, then we like promote each other's like happiness, and so it's all built on happiness and not necessarily on like survival is like a secondary kind of like a result of that. Because that's kind of what I was hearing today at the table. What would you say to that kind of assertion?
So you were hearing that here or someplace else in the on campus, you mean?
Yeah.
That's good, because I didn't think I said that.
No.
So happiness is kind of a pet peeve. Happiness is never really advocated as the goal of Christianity, for example. So God never says, I sent I died on the cross so you could be happy.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I died on the cross so you could have life.
Yeah.
And so the goal for Christians is not happiness but joy, finding satisfaction in Christ in spite of circumstances, not because of them. And so if happiness is the goal, we're never going to get there. So if someone would be made happy by punching someone else in the nose, your right to feel happy by doing that ends at the other person's nose. You can't have it both ways. So where there's a conflict of what makes someone happy, i.e. not getting my nose punched, and with your desire to punch, you can't have it both ways. So you can't make everybody happy all the time. Now there's certainly some neutral things that are not in that kind of a category. But that's the problem, is if your goal is happiness, you'll never get there for very long, because happiness is fleeting. Joy, on the other hand, is much different. It's a spiritual satisfaction that Paul could experience in prison, that Christ experienced, going to the cross. He never said, I've lost my joy, but he certainly didn't enjoy what he was going through. So his happiness wasn't very high, but his joy in completing his mission must have been different than we can imagine. I don't know if that answered your question. To help?
Yeah, I think that helps. Yeah, I think that there's sort of like because of the state of humanity having both a sense of right and wrong and also this brokenness that doesn't live up to it.
Mm-hmm.
Conclusions or like explanations that would kind of most explanations that are like natural tend to seem to like veer to one side or the other. It's like, well, if you take this to its natural conclusion, then we would all be completely like kumbaya.
Right, right.
And then if you take this one to its natural conclusion, then we would all want to kill each other and yet like most fit survive.
Yeah, so you look at any dictatorial situation, and whoever's in power is doing what makes them happy.
Right.
But the rest of the world, or the society, or whoever they're inflicting themselves upon, is not so happy. So you get this competing human flourishing idea. Is human flourishing the survival of the really strong, or is it the largest number of people? There's no way to arbitrate those from strictly human flourishing as the measurement of moral rightness. Yeah, good question. What else? Yeah.
So, earlier on the other slide, you kind of made the assertion that because, like, assuming naturalism, because, the idea that, morality from evolution could promote bad behavior because survival of the fittest, I hate that term, but because it could promote bad behavior, therefore it can't be the source of morality. I don't see how that follows.
No, and I agree with you to an extent. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So all moral systems that we have are all based on in-group survival. Well, in-group. I hate to use the term flourishing, but for lack of a better term, in-group flourishing, and says either nothing or at the expense of the out-group of people. And you can see this even in the Bible, because when Moses leads everyone to the promised land, there's people there, and God commands them to ethnically cleanse the region, and that's because it comes from God, that's seen as moral, even though it's for the flourishing of the Israelites, but it comes at the expense of the people that were already living there.
Yeah, so that's a good example too, and in those situations, the people that were being displaced had been warned by God multiple times about practices that were ungodly. They were worshiping other gods, which again is not aligned with the true reality of the universe, which is God as the creator. That was the point that God was willing to push the Israelites to help him in that regard. They were doing things like child sacrifice, sacrificing infants in the fires of Moloch, all kinds of atrocities. And so where you see the Israelites wiping out an entire people group, that's what was happening in the backstory.
So do two wrongs make a right?
Absolutely not. But the question is that a wrong? So that goes back to the question, is lying, stealing, killing ever justified? And if it's justified by protecting the innocent, i.e. those that are not going in the wrong direction and leading others astray, then is it justified? And in God's economy it was. And those are hard passages. I don't.
Well, they didn't say the innocent. God commanded them to kill everything that lived.
And who is
except for the virgin girls, they could save those for themselves.
There are some problems that are difficult to align. I completely agree with that. But the greater story is that God was trying to purify for himself a people who were devoted to him. And that is the nature of reality, is that, again, if God is the essence of reality, then being aligned with him is the ultimate good. And so by trying to purify himself a people dedicated to himself, that was the pattern that he wanted the rest of the world to follow. They were to be a blessing to the world. They didn't always follow that. They don't follow that today all the way. The Jews in Israel are not always a blessing to people. But again, we have difficult. Then we get into eschatology and things that are beyond the scope of this discussion. But anyway, so you've raised some really good questions. There are not good answers for all those things, and so that's where we as Christians trust God and the Word as it's described. That those issues of wiping out certain groups were for moral good in the greater sense, and very difficult in the smaller sense. I read one of those passages today. It's hard to read, where they wiped out the city of Ai and killed every living thing. It's like, wow, that's harsh.
Yeah, even the animals.
No, he didn't see them that way, but he saw them as people that were going the wrong direction and could not be brought back.
Commanding that they kill the people and their livestock.
Yeah.
Everything with the breath of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything with the breath of life.
Yep. Those are hard passages.
Well, the flood to kind of
Yeah.
steel man your argument, I killed everything on the face of the planet except 8 people and 2 of every kind, or a few more. And,
Right. In the case of the clean animals, right?
Right.
Again, beyond the scope of the discussion, but yes, you're right. Those are hard truths. Yeah. Did you have?
Oh, I was just tempted to throw in another comment, that at the time, it did say that, the people had had opportunity to repent, and God had given them time, but they had gone further and further into sin. But while he was carrying out his judgment on the Canaanites, the rules for the countries around there, where he was not bringing his judgment, the Jews were not allowed to just
Right.
go in and kill those people at all. God forbade them. He said, you go and you offer terms of peace. And so it was a very specific group of people, as,
Right.
like you said. And
Yeah, there's-
not, the humans didn't have the right to kill them.
Yeah,
It was
right.
divine judgment.
Only the ones that God said. There's a book by Paul Copan called "Is God a Moral Monster?" I'd recommend that for your consideration. That explains these in better detail than I can do off the top of my, I'll spur of the moment, if you will. But there are good answers for those things. That's not my field of expertise. There's a lot of things I'm not an expert in. That's another one. But I think that book would be helpful on that subject for anybody who struggles with this issue of why did God do that in the Old Testament? Those are tough questions, and they're worth considering.
Yeah, I have more to add on the sort of in-group, at-group topic, but I'll let other people get a chance
Okay.
to talk first.
Thanks. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about Penfield's experiment and, I guess the conclusion of it. So, to my understanding, it seems like a conclusion for that could be that sometimes we can do things that may not be what we want to do. Like, for example, how he was able to stimulate the brain to do certain things that the person didn't will for them to do. So how would you, I guess, reconcile that with free will?
This is the one where they were stimulated in the brain to move their arm, or they had to choose, and he would always ask for review, he would always ask the test question, did you do that, or did you command that, or did I command that? And they always knew whether they had done it or not. And so your question is, how does that align with free will?
Yeah, I guess how does it align with free will? And then, yeah, doesn't that mean that we can do things that are not what we want to do?
Yeah, so I think it says that there is a connection between the soul, spirit, the entity that is you, and the physical brain. You can interact with that physical brain, and I can make my arm do something when I choose to do it. But there also are times when I can override my inclination to do something, and that's where the moral won't comes in. So I might feel like I wanted to do something that was sinful and choose not to do it, even though I have a sinful desire to do it. And that's where free will comes in, and we can override our choices that seem attractive at the time, but they're a bad idea. Does that help? So there is an interaction, but we still have the override authority on physical and moral choices.
And I think that as far as like the kind of like freaky electrical,
Yeah.
affecting him, I kind of think of that as like people who have like a spasm or something, or like an eye twitch, and it's like really weird if you ever have your eye twitch where it's like my eye is like moving but I'm not like controlling it, or sometimes I'll like fall asleep because I sleep on my stomach more than I should, and I'll have my arm in just the right position where it'll like go completely numb, and then it's just like this floppy thing, and it's like it'll like move, or I'll like feel it on myself, and I'm like, this doesn't feel like my arm anymore. And so in that sense, like, we can lose control of our bodies and of our,
I think that has to do with blood circulation, but yes, yeah.
motor function, we
Yeah,
can lose control,
right.
or have it do things, but that isn't like, something like taking control of our free will. It's like,
Yeah.
you're not actually the one willing that, so. Yeah.
I have something to add that's relevant. So in high school, I had a friend, she could not feel anything on one side of her body, but she could still like write and move, and like you wouldn't know unless she told you.
Wow.
And so I think that, kind of ties in.
So that was a partial paralysis issue.
Well, she wasn't paralyzed, she just couldn't feel anything.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So
The
like,
other, yeah.
So like what Jacob was saying, like if she were to like touch her arm with one arm that she couldn't feel, it wouldn't like, it'd be kind of the same thing, but she like was willing it to do so. So she knew that it was like her touching, but it still felt weird.
Yeah. That's an abnormality. And, yeah. Because we have a sense of what's the way things are supposed to work. Yeah.
I was just going to say, last year, some of you may have been here when the guy spoke on the soul. It was a fascinating presentation, I thought. But I found it really helpful because one of the things I wondered about, what about people with dementia? What about people who don't have the control over their wills and maybe do things that are totally uncharacteristic of that person as you know them? But he brought out the point that the soul depends on the body for its ability to express itself. So when the body is no longer functioning properly, the soul is not able to express itself the way it might desire, which might come a little bit to, yes, there are sometimes when a person does not have the ability to control his will. It's not that something is wrong with the will, it is something is wrong with the vehicle that the will functions on.
Yeah. And so there was that one slide where it said, these are the things the brain does, and it was physical motion and some other things along there. And there are other things that the brain interacts with but doesn't control. So yeah, that's a good, I would be curious to ask him what he thinks about the issue of dementia. I don't know where his research would fit into that kind of loss of capability.
Well, that's the break between the mind and the soul, isn't it? Where the brain is not properly communicating with the soul.
The brain seems to be degenerating in its ability to do its functions, and that
That connection, whatever that is being lost or perverted.
Yeah, you would think that the persistent vegetative state issue where the brain still fires in those situations, or the out-of-body experience where the soul is fully functional and completely apart from the brain. You would think that there'd be some explanatory power there that we could leverage somehow in dementia situations, but I haven't seen anything on that.
Yeah.
It didn't come up in the talk that he gave at any rate.
Yeah, I was also hearing about, I think it was an article on Mind Matters where they were talking about the person who had a spike go through his head.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, and he didn't, it was like Phileas or something. And
Phineas Gage.
the classic story
Yeah.
about him is that his personality completely changed. He became this like horrible person the moment that happened. But
Yeah.
if you actually look at the historical record, it was a very, very like, he acted like a completely normal person until like he was like elderly, and then he started having some problems like you mentioned, and so it was greatly exaggerated, the effects that had on
Interesting.
his personality.
So you're saying it could have been related to a dementia onset as well, or something
Right,
like
or
that?
something else, and
Yeah.
and I think that it is just interesting, some of the personality and like how our I wonder if too like the way that you mentioned like free don't or free won't, and how you can veto something, and sometimes I think that your soul, and when you reinforce, whatever you're doing in your soul, it can actually kind of affect that. And if your brain is constantly, like suggesting things, that can also maybe affect that. So it's just interesting, the interplay there. But I do think that, and that's something that Eric was saying, was that your soul is only going to, or you're gonna like for instance with alcohol, it'll kind of squeeze out things that are already there, not
Yeah.
necessarily creating new.
Yeah, they talk about doing a habit a certain number of times to create new neural pathways.
Yeah.
And that's way beyond my scope of
Sure.
anything, but yeah.
Final question, anybody? All right, sounds good.
Maybe.
So if you had 30 seconds to like explain this issue, like if someone was just, if you're in a conversation and the morality came up, what would you want to emphasize the most?
I think the interplay, the three things, that you have consciousness, that's a real thing. You have free will, because you can make choices. And you have this sense of right and wrong. Even the gang member example, that they have a point beyond which they won't violate the gang code. So all of us have those things. It's a question of how we shape them and how we use them, and is there an ultimate source of those things? So that's kind of what I would do in 30 seconds, I think. And it probably wouldn't be enough, because it's ultimately, as you and I were talking about over dinner, it's a spiritual choice to be receptive to the ultimate answer that we come up with, which is God is the creator of the universe. He is the ultimate good, and we need to be aligned with that reality. And that's a spiritual choice.
So I'm sure Rick will stay around if we want to have any further conversation afterwards. Again, let's thank Rick.
Thank you.
I forgot to recognize Tyler and Jay as first-timers here, yeah? Second time, okay, we came when Rick was here before. Tyler, thanks for joining us.
I forgot to mention,
Yes.
if anybody's interested, tomorrow night we are doing session 4 of 6 sessions on evidence for God from design in the universe. And tomorrow is all focused on animals and the creative and unusual designs that could not be explained through evolution. And so that'll be mostly a movie night, movie clips of animals and explanations of things that are hard to explain. And that's at 121 Community Church in Grapevine, if anybody's interested. 6:30 tomorrow.
6:30, all right. I'll put that out on the group meeting.
Great.
As a reminder. Next week, we've got Rebecca Lowe teaching on slavery in the Bible. Oftentimes questions or misunderstandings or confusion about that. And so anything you want to add to that?
I just think it's a really fascinating topic, so.
Sure is.
It's a good follow-on to this one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Look forward to it.
I will not have all the answers.
All right. Let me close this up with prayer, you guys. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time of everybody here tonight. loving you with our minds, Lord. And thank you for giving us the minds that we have. Thank you for giving us the free will and the consciousness that we have that is different from other animals, Lord, and making us in your image. We ask that you would give us the words to express that to friends and family. We want you to bless Rick and his ministry, and we thank you again for his time.